He built the house before he had anyone to fill it. He set 2 chairs on an unfinished porch in the middle of nowhere, Kansas, in the dead of autumn, with nothing but wind and doubt for company. His neighbors said he'd lost his mind. Maybe he had. But Gideon Hale wasn't building a ranch. He was building a life for someone who didn't know he existed yet. And somewhere in Philadelphia, a woman was reading words that would change everything she thought she knew about herself. This is the story of 2 strangers, 2 chairs, and one impossible gamble that neither of them could afford to lose. If this story moves you, hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far these 2 chairs have traveled. The Kansas prairie in October doesn't care about you. That's the first thing you learn when you've been out here long enough, when the novelty of wide open space has worn itself down to something more honest, more indifferent. The sky does what it wants. The wind comes when it feels like it and leaves without explanation. The grass bends, recovers, bends again, and never once asks permission. Out here, the land doesn't accommodate your plans. You accommodate its moods, or you pack up and go back east with your tail between your legs, and a story about how the frontier wasn't what you thought it would be. Gideon Hale had been on this particular stretch of Rooks County for going on 4 years by the autumn of 1879, and he had long since made his peace with the prairie's indifference. What he hadn't made peace with, what still snagged at him on long evenings when the work was done and the silence settled in like an uninvited guest, was the particular kind of loneliness that doesn't announce itself, the kind that sneaks up slow, the kind that doesn't hit you all at once, but accumulates, day after quiet day, until one morning you realize you haven't said a full sentence out loud in 4 days, and the sound of your own voice startles you. He was 31 years old. His hands were already the hands of a man 10 years older, cracked at the knuckles, rough across the palms, permanently darkened in the creases where the dirt had worked itself in too deep to come out with ordinary washing. His face had been weathered by 2 years of brutal Kansas summers into something lean and angular, the kind of face that people trusted instinctively, not because it was particularly handsome, but because it looked like it had survived something and come out the other side still upright. He was by any reasonable measure doing all right. He had 160 acres of mostly flat land under a homestead claim, a decent well that had never gone dry, 43 head of mixed cattle, and a reputation among the other settlers in the county as a man who kept his word and didn't complain more than the situation warranted. His wheat had come in solid for 2 of the last 3 years. The one bad year, 77, when the rains didn't cooperate and half his yield dried on the stalk, he'd managed without borrowing, which was more than most men could say. By the frontier's exacting standards, Gideon Hale was a success. But the house was still not finished, not because he lacked the skills. He'd built the frame himself over the first summer, straight and solid, without the amateur mistakes that plagued men who'd grown up in cities and thought homesteading was something you could learn from a pamphlet. The exterior walls were up. The roof was sound. He'd triple-checked the seams after the first hard rain, fixed the 2 spots where water had worked through. He had a proper door with iron hinges he'd bartered for in Stockton, and glass windows on the south side, which was a luxury most of his neighbors hadn't bothered with yet. But the interior remained roughly finished. The floor was packed earth in 2 of the 3 rooms. The fireplace in the main room worked, but hadn't been properly mortared along the top seam, something he kept meaning to fix. There were gaps between some of the interior wallboards that let the wind through at angles in the winter that made the whole space feel less like shelter and more like a suggestion of shelter. His nearest neighbor, a stubborn Norwegian named Anders Bjornson, who ran cattle on the adjacent section, had offered his opinion on the subject of Gideon's house roughly once a month for the past 2 years. "You're going to let it fall apart from the inside," Anders had told him last spring, leaning against the fence post at the property line with his arms crossed and his expression carrying the particular brand of Scandinavian disapproval that managed to communicate concern and contempt simultaneously. "A man finishes his house. You don't leave a house half done." "It's not half done," Gideon had said. "The important parts are done. The floor's dirt. Floors can wait." Anders had looked at him for a long moment. "What are you waiting for?" And Gideon had said something vague about having other priorities, which was not untrue, but was also not the real answer. The real answer was something he hadn't said out loud to anyone. because saying it out loud to Anders Bjornsson would have invited the kind of ridicule that, while probably good-natured, he didn't particularly feel like dealing with. The real answer was that he was waiting to finish the house with someone else, that it felt wrong to complete it alone, that finishing the interior rooms, laying down a proper floor, hanging curtains in those south-facing windows, all of it felt like it belonged to a future that included another person, and doing it by himself felt like giving up on that future before he'd even tried, which was, he understood perfectly well, not entirely rational. But Gideon Hale had noticed, over the course of 31 years on this earth, that the things worth wanting were rarely arrived at by purely rational means. He built them on a Thursday in late October, when the first serious cold had moved through and left the grass stiff and silvered at the tips. It wasn't a planned project. He'd been working on a storage cabinet for the back room, cutting oak planks he'd been saving for the purpose, fitting the joints, and somewhere in the middle of it, the cabinet stopped feeling interesting and the chairs started feeling necessary. He couldn't have explained the logic of it if he'd tried. He just set the cabinet planks aside, picked up a different piece of wood, and started roughing out what would become the back of a chair. He worked through the afternoon without stopping, which was unusual for him. Gideon was methodical by nature, a man who took breaks at regular intervals because he'd learned early that sustained work done without rest produced mistakes, and mistakes on the frontier cost more than time. But that Thursday, he didn't stop. He worked until the light got bad, and then he moved the lantern closer and kept going. By midnight, he had 2 chairs. They weren't fancy. He was a practical woodworker, not a craftsman. He could make things that were solid and functional, but he didn't have the patience for decorative work, for carved details or shaped armrests, or any of the refinements that might have made them look like something from a parlor catalog. They were straight-backed, broad-seated, with legs he'd carefully leveled so they sat flat without rocking. He'd sanded them until the wood was smooth enough that you could run your hand across it without catching splinters. They were the kind of chairs that would last 20 years with ordinary use, that would look exactly the same in a decade as they did now. Not beautiful, but permanent. He carried them out to the porch at midnight, positioning them side by side, facing east, toward the dark shape of the horizon. Then he sat down in one of them. The night was clear and cold. The stars out here were nothing like what he'd grown up with in eastern Missouri. They were brighter, more numerous, uncompeted by any city lights, spread across the sky in such overwhelming quantity that they stopped being individual points of light and became something more like texture, like the sky itself had grain. He'd never quite gotten used to it, even after 4 years. It still struck him on nights like this as something close to excessive, like the universe was showing off. He sat in his chair and looked at the empty one beside him. The empty chair didn't make him sad, exactly. That wasn't quite the right word for what he felt. It was more like an argument. The chair was an argument he was making with himself, a stake driven into the ground, a declaration of something he intended to be true. He had built this chair for a specific person. He didn't know her name. He didn't know what she looked like or where she came from or what she thought about when she couldn't sleep. But he knew she existed, with the same bone-deep certainty that he knew this land existed, that this sky existed, that the cold coming off the prairie was real and not something he'd imagined. He was going to find her. He didn't know how yet, but that was a logistics problem, and logistics problems had solutions if you were willing to think them through carefully enough. He sat in his chair until the cold got serious enough that staying outside stopped making sense. Then he went inside, laid down on his bunk, and slept better than he had in months. The idea came to him gradually, the way most of his better ideas did. Not as a sudden flash of inspiration, but as a slow accretion, pieces drifting in over days until suddenly they were all in the same place, and the shape of the thing became clear. He'd seen mail-order marriage advertisements before. Most men in his situation had. The frontier had a chronic shortage of women. That was simply a demographic reality, the kind of thing you didn't need a newspaper to tell you when you could look around at a gathering and count 3 men for every woman. And the mechanism of correspondence marriages had evolved to address it. You placed an advertisement in an Eastern paper. Women in cities who were looking for different lives responded. Letters were exchanged. Sometimes people met. Sometimes they married. Sometimes it worked out. The advertisements he'd read, though, had always struck him as profoundly wrong-headed. They were written like business proposals. Good Kansas farmer, 34, healthy, 200 acres, looking for Christian woman of good moral character for matrimony. Or, young man of means and excellent reputation seeks wife, 18 to 25, willing to relocate west. They listed assets like an inventory. They described what the man could offer in economic terms, what he expected in return. Some of them were so transactional they might as well have been contracts for livestock. Gideon sat at the small table he used as a desk, a piece of paper in front of him, a pen in his hand, and thought about what he actually wanted to say. He wasn't interested in writing an advertisement that described his assets. Any woman reading such a thing would understand quickly enough that his assets, while respectable, were not spectacular. 43 head of cattle and 160 acres of prairie was not a fortune, no matter how it was framed. She would also understand that the life being offered was genuinely hard in ways that no amount of careful language could fully obscure. What he wanted to say was something else, something true. He wrote for a long time, scratching out sentences, starting over, getting frustrated, going for a walk, coming back and writing again. He went through 4 drafts. The 4th draft was still not right, but it was close enough that he could see what he was reaching for. The final version read, Kansas homesteader, 31, seeks a partner in the proper sense of the word. Not a housekeeper, not a decoration, not a woman willing to disappear herself into a man's existing life. I have built a house on 160 acres of open prairie in Rooks County, Kansas. The house is mostly finished. There is a porch that faces east, and I have put 2 chairs on it, side by side. One is mine. One is empty. I am looking for the person the second chair belongs to. I cannot promise comfort or luxury. I can promise honesty, steadiness, and a genuine interest in whatever you think and want and believe. If you have ever looked at your life and felt that its edges were drawn by someone else's hand and you wanted to redraw them, write to me. G. Hale, Rooks County, Kansas. He read it over 3 times. It was not what anyone would call a conventional advertisement. It was too long, too odd, too specific about things that weren't the normal subjects of such notices, and too vague about things that were. It said almost nothing about his finances, or his religious affiliation, or his family background. All the things that readers of these columns expected to be told. He folded it up and sent it to 3 papers, one in Kansas City, one in Chicago, and one in Philadelphia. Then he went back to work on the storage cabinet and tried not to think about it. He should have known Anders would hear about it. In Rooks County in 1879, information traveled at approximately the speed of gossip, which was considerably faster than information had any right to travel, given the distances between homesteads. It was Bjornson's youngest daughter, Ingrid, who'd spotted the advertisement in the Kansas City paper while visiting her cousin in Osborne. She'd brought the paper home, shown it to her father, and Anders had arrived at Gideon's fence line the following morning with an expression that suggested he'd been working on what he wanted to say for most of the night. I saw your notice, Anders said without preamble. He was a large man, broad across the chest, with a white blonde beard that had earned him the nickname the Old Viking among the other settlers, which he pretended to dislike and actually was rather pleased by. Good morning to you too, Gideon said. He was mending a section of fence that the cattle had leaned on too hard, and he kept his attention on the work. You wrote about the chairs. I did. You told the whole world about the chairs. I told 3 newspapers about the chairs. I don't know that that qualifies as the whole world. Anders was quiet for a moment. Gideon could feel the weight of his neighbor's assessment settling over the situation like weather. Finally, Anders said, It's strange, Gideon. I know. A man doesn't usually... I know what a man usually does, Gideon said, setting down his pliers and looking up. I'm not doing what a man usually does. I know how it looks. I'm not particularly concerned about how it looks. I'm not talking about how it looks, Anders said, which was only partially true. I'm talking about, you're putting your private business in a newspaper. You're telling strangers things that men don't. I'm not putting my private business in a newspaper, Gideon said. I'm putting an honest thing in a newspaper. There's a difference. Anders opened his mouth, closed it, ran a hand over his beard. What if nobody writes back? He finally said. Then nobody writes back. And the chair sits empty. Then the chair sits empty for a while longer. I'm not going to die of embarrassment, Anders. I've embarrassed myself in worse ways than this. Another long pause. The wind moved through the fence grass, and two of Gideon's cattle shifted positions in the middle distance, uninterested in the conversation. "My wife's sister is coming out from Minnetonka in the spring," Anders said, in a tone that was meant to sound casual and failed completely. "She's 33, she's a good woman, she can—" "I appreciate it," Gideon said, in a tone that ended that particular sentence. Anders nodded slowly. "You're stubborn," he said. "I prefer specific," Gideon said. He picked up his pliers and went back to the fence. Anders stood there another minute, then walked back toward his property, shaking his head in the slow, deliberate way of a man who has done what he could and is washing his hands of the outcome. The first responses arrived 3 weeks after he'd sent the advertisements. There were 11 of them in the first batch, which the postmaster in Stockton handed over with an expression somewhere between curiosity and amusement. Some were short, a few lines, clearly written in a hurry or without much thought, by women who had read the notice and responded almost reflexively without thinking too carefully about what they were responding to. Some were longer, but formal, the kind of letters where every sentence had been measured and weighed until all the life had been pressed out of them. 2 were from women who turned out to be responding on behalf of their daughters, who had apparently not been consulted about being offered up by correspondence, which Gideon found both sad and faintly comic. He read all of them carefully. He wrote back to 4. The letter from Philadelphia was in the second batch, which arrived 10 days later. He almost missed it. It was tucked between 2 other envelopes, unremarkable in its appearance. The address written in a hand that was precise without being elegant, the kind of handwriting you'd expect from someone accustomed to setting type rather than composing personal correspondence. The return address was a rooming house on Chestnut Street. He opened it on the porch in the gathering dusk, with his coat on because the evening air had teeth in it. "Dear Mr. Hale, I will tell you immediately that I debated for a week and a half whether to write this letter, and that I'm still not entirely certain I should. I work as a compositor at a print shop on Market Street. I set type for other people's words all day. I know what makes a notice effective, and I know when someone is using language to create an impression they want, rather than to say something true. Most notices in the correspondence columns are doing exactly that. Yours is not. That's why I'm writing. I'm not writing because I think your farm sounds appealing, or because I've always dreamed of the frontier. I haven't. The prairie, from what I've read, sounds relentlessly difficult, and I see no reason to pretend otherwise. I'm writing because the thing you said about the edges of a life being drawn by someone else's hand, that sentence stopped me completely. I had to put the paper down. I've thought about that sentence every day since I read it. I'm 26. I'm not naive, though I suspect you'll wonder about that anyway. I'm also not particularly biddable, which is probably something you should know early. If you write back, tell me something true. Margaret Whitlock. Gideon read the letter twice. Then he sat in his chair, the one that was his, and looked at the empty one for a long time. He went inside and wrote back that night. Dear Miss Whitlock, something true. I started the second chair before I started the first one. I built the back legs and the seat of what became the empty chair, and then realized I was making 2 chairs, not 1. So the chair was always meant to exist. I didn't decide on it later. I don't know what that means exactly. But you said to tell you something true, and that's the truest thing I can think of right now. The prairie is relentlessly difficult. You're right about that. I won't dress it up. What do you do when you're not setting type? G. Hale. He sealed it, addressed it, and rode into Stockton the next morning before the sun was fully up to post it. What happened over the next months was nothing like the courtship Gideon had imagined when he'd pictured this process. Not that he'd pictured it precisely, more that he'd had a vague notion of how these things went. And the reality turned out to be both more awkward and more genuine than any notion he'd carried. The letters came and went every 10 days to 2 weeks. The exact timing depending on the mail routes and the weather and whatever pressures were operating on the other end. During the 3 weeks in December when a series of blizzards shut down the roads in and out of Stockton, he went without a letter from her for so long that he found himself inventing reasons to ride into town, ostensibly for supplies, in a way that he recognized as transparently motivated and couldn't quite make himself stop. What he discovered, letter by letter, was a person of considerable precision. Margaret Whitlock did not write the way women were supposed to write, the way the correspondence columns suggested women wrote, all softness and deference and carefully managed impressions. She wrote the way she thought, which was directly, with very little preamble and a pronounced intolerance for evasion. When she asked him a question, it was usually a question he'd been hoping to avoid, and when he tried to answer it in a way that was technically truthful but somewhat sideways of the real thing, she had an uncanny ability to identify what he'd done and call it out in her next letter without particular malice, but with complete clarity. You said you managed during the bad harvest year, but you didn't say what that meant specifically. What did it actually mean? Did you go without things? Did you borrow? Did you consider leaving? He'd written back, I ate less than I should have for about 4 months. I didn't borrow. I didn't consider leaving, but I also didn't think much about it, which might be worse. Maybe I should have considered it and consciously decided to stay. Instead, I just never thought of going. She'd responded, I think that's important, that you didn't think of leaving. I think that tells me something about how you're built. He'd read that sentence several times, turning it over, not entirely sure what to do with being examined so carefully and finding it did not bother him the way he'd expected it to. She told him about the print shop, the smell of it, which she said was ink and metal, and the particular kind of dry heat that came off the presses in winter, and how after 7 years she knew every letter in every case by feel, could reach blind and pull the right type. She told him about the other compositors, mostly men who had been initially hostile to her presence, and then, over years, become something like colleagues, in the grudging, competitive way of people who respect what someone can do, even when they'd rather not. She told him about the city, in the particular way of someone who knows a place too well to romanticize it. The parts she loved, the parts that exhausted her, the particular gray of the Delaware River on winter mornings from the Market Street Bridge. She did not tell him why she felt trapped there, not directly, but it came through in the small accumulations of things she said, the way she described her daily route, always the same, always containing the same landmarks in the same order, the way she described the other women she knew whose lives had proceeded along rails so clearly defined that deviation had become almost unimaginable, the way she occasionally, in the middle of describing something else entirely, stopped and wrote something like, Sometimes I think the city keeps you safe by making you too small to need saving. He thought about that sentence for days. It came in February, which was appropriate. February on the Kansas prairie was the month most designed by nature to strip away pretension and reveal what was actually underneath. It started with something small, which was how the real disagreements usually started. He had written, describing his plans for the coming planting season, about his decision to reduce his wheat acreage and expand his cattle operation. It was a sound decision. He'd done the calculations 3 times, talked it through with 2 neighbors whose judgment he respected, and arrived at the same conclusion each time. Wheat prices were unpredictable and trending in the wrong direction, while beef prices in the eastern markets were solid. But he had described it to Margaret in the particular way he had of stating conclusions without much explanation of the reasoning, because the reasoning seemed obvious to him, and he'd assumed it would seem obvious to her. It did not seem obvious to her. You've made this decision alone, she wrote, and the sentence was so short and so stripped of anything decorative that it landed like a stone through glass. That is your right, since it's your farm and your livelihood, and none of this is any of my business yet. But I want to be honest with you. If this is a vision of what partnership will look like, one person making the decisions and informing the other after the fact, that's something I need to understand now, before I've done anything irreversible. He read the letter 3 times and felt the particular heat that came with being misunderstood by someone whose opinion mattered to him. He wrote back quickly, which was his first mistake. The letter he sent that evening was too long and too defensive, explaining his reasoning in detail that shaded into something that sounded like justification for something he didn't think required justifying, which made him sound more defensive still. He posted it before he'd thought it through properly, and regretted it the moment he handed it to the postmaster. Her response, when it came 2 weeks later, was measured. I think you heard what I said as criticism of your decision. That's not what it was. I don't know enough about cattle prices or wheat futures to have an opinion about your planting strategy, and I wasn't trying to second-guess you. What I was saying, and I see I didn't say it clearly enough, is that I'm trying to understand what you mean by partnership, not a correction, an honest question. He sat with that for a full day before he wrote back. I think I heard it wrong, he finally wrote, and then I answered the thing I heard instead of the thing you said. That's a habit I have, and I don't like it in myself. What I meant by partnership is two people who decide things together, who both have a real say in what happens. I didn't think of this wheat decision as a partnership decision because I made it before. He stopped. Started again. Because I made it before I'd let myself fully believe this was real. That you were real. That there was going to be an us that made decisions together. I think I've been holding some part of myself back from believing in this. And I've been doing it because being wrong about something this important would be... He stopped again. It would be a long way to fall. He sent it. Then he sat on his porch in the February cold and looked at the empty chair until his hands went numb, and then he went inside. Her response came 12 days later, and it was 3 sentences long. I understand about holding back. I'm doing it too. Let's both try to stop. He pinned that letter to the wall above his desk, where he could see it when he worked. Spring came to the prairie in increments, the way it always did. Not all at once, but gradually. The frost backing off by degrees, the grass going from silver brown to something approaching green, the wind losing its cutting edge by fractions. Gideon was mending the north fence on a Tuesday morning in early March, when Anders came across the property line with the kind of deliberate pace that meant he was carrying news and hadn't decided yet how to deliver it. "Letter came for you from Philadelphia," Anders said. "Ingrid was picking up supplies in Stockton, and the postmaster asked her to bring it out since the road is still bad." Gideon took the letter from him. The handwriting was Margaret's, but the envelope was thicker than usual. Anders stood there. "You can go, Anders," Gideon said, not unkindly. "I'm not—" Anders paused. "Are you going to open it?" Gideon opened it. There were 2 sheets. He read the first one, and his expression did something that Anders, watching from a polite but insufficient distance, could not quite interpret. He handed the first sheet to Anders. Anders read it. His eyebrows went up, then down. Then he read it again. "Gideon, I have to tell you something that I don't know how to tell you, so I'm going to say it plainly. My father had a stroke 3 weeks ago. He's alive, and the doctors say he may recover substantially, but he needs care, and there's no one else. My brother is in Baltimore, and I'll just say he's not reliable. I can't leave Philadelphia. I don't know for how long. I don't know if this changes everything between us. I'm afraid it does. I'm also afraid to say that because I don't want to give you a reason to stop writing. Tell me what you think, please." Anders read to the end of the page. Then he looked at Gideon, who was already reading the second sheet. "What does the second page say?" Anders asked. Gideon read it through once more, then handed that page over too. The second page was half blank. The words that were there were in the same precise hand as the first, but something in them was different. Something in the pressure of the pen, the way the letters sat on the page. "I sat down to write you 3 times before this letter. Wrote 2 full drafts and tore them up because they were me trying to sound like I had it together, and I don't have it together. I watched my father not recognize me for about 30 seconds last Tuesday, and then he did, and then he cried, and I held his hand and didn't say anything because there was nothing to say, and later I walked home along Chestnut Street in the cold and thought about 2 chairs on a prairie porch that I've never seen, and thought, I want to be there. I want to be somewhere that is not here. I know that's not fair to you. I'm saying it anyway." Anders folded both sheets with surprising care and handed them back to Gideon. They stood in the thin March sun for a moment. "Well," Anders said. "Well," Gideon agreed. "What are you going to write back?" Gideon was already walking toward the house. "I don't know yet," he called back, "but I'm going to get it right this time." He wrote for 4 hours. He went through 3 complete drafts. He told her that the chairs were not going anywhere. He told her that the second chair had waited this long already and could wait longer, and that patience was not a particularly difficult thing for him, that he'd been practicing it for years without realizing it was practice. And now that he understood what he was practicing for, it seemed almost easy. He told her he was not going anywhere either. He told her, and this was the sentence he spent the most time on, the sentence he wrote and crossed out and rewrote 5 times before he got the shape of it right. He told her that a man who couldn't wait for something worth waiting for didn't deserve to have it. He signed it. "I'll be here. Take whatever time you need. The chair is yours." He rode into Stockton before the post closed that evening, handed it across the counter, and rode back home in the gathering dusk with the wind coming hard from the northwest and the stars just starting to show themselves above the horizon. He ate supper alone. He went to bed. He did not look at the empty chair that night. Some things you looked at to remind yourself of what you wanted. Other things you looked away from, so the wanting didn't eat you alive. He was learning, slowly, which was which. The letters kept coming through the spring, though they changed in texture after her father's stroke. Less philosophical now, more immediate, carrying the particular kind of exhaustion that settles into a person's writing when they are doing hard work every day and trying not to complain about it. Margaret had never been a woman who complained easily. That much Gideon had understood early. But there was a difference between someone who didn't complain and someone who had nothing to complain about. And reading her letters through March and into April, he could feel the weight of what she wasn't saying pressing against every sentence she did write. She described the apartment on Chestnut Street where she'd moved her father after it became clear he couldn't manage the stairs at his own place. 3 rooms, west-facing windows that caught the late afternoon light badly. A landlady named Mrs. Purcell, who was not unkind but had very specific opinions about noise after 8 o'clock in the evening. She described her father in the measured way a person describes something they are learning to live with. Some days his speech was almost clear. Other days the words came out scrambled in ways that seemed to frustrate him more than they frightened him. And watching a man be frustrated by his own mind was its own particular kind of difficult. She went to the print shop in the mornings, came home at noon to check on him, went back in the afternoon, came home again in the evening to make supper and sit with him until he fell asleep. She did this 7 days a week because there was no one else to do it. She didn't write, "I'm exhausted." She wrote, "I've started drinking my coffee standing at the window because sitting down in the mornings makes me feel like I might not get back up." Gideon read that sentence and sat with it for a long time. He wanted to fix it. That was his instinct. The same instinct that made him good at the practical work of homesteading, the part of him that looked at a broken fence or a sick animal or a weather problem and immediately started calculating solutions. But this was not a broken fence. There was no solution he could offer from 1,400 miles away, except to keep writing, to keep being the one consistent thing in her days that cost her nothing and asked nothing of her except that she pick up a pen when she had the energy. So he wrote. More than he had before, and differently. He stopped trying to be interesting, stopped thinking about the letters as a way of presenting himself well, which he hadn't fully realized he'd been doing until he stopped. He wrote about the ordinary days, the way the light moved across the prairie in the early mornings when the dew was still on the grass, the running argument he was having with one of his bulls, a large and magnificently stubborn animal he'd named Jefferson, a joke that had seemed funnier when he named him, who had developed the habit of pressing against the east fence in a way that was going to bring it down eventually if Gideon couldn't convince him to stop, which so far he could not. He wrote about a meal he'd made badly, a stew he'd oversalted to the point of genuine inedibility, and how he'd eaten it anyway out of stubbornness and then felt terrible for 2 days. He wrote about the spring storms that came in off the western plain with a kind of theatrical violence he'd never stopped finding impressive, the way the sky turned that particular green-yellow color 20 minutes before the serious weather arrived, a color that existed nowhere else in nature except directly above Kansas in late April. He wrote, in other words, like a person talking to another person they trusted, not like a man trying to make a woman want to come west. She noticed. "Your letters have changed," she wrote in early May. "I don't mean that as a complaint. I mean it as, I think I understand you better now. The Jefferson story. I've thought about that bull more than I should have this week. I picture him at the fence, completely confident that he's right about it, and it makes me laugh, which is something I haven't done enough of lately. So thank you for Jefferson." He wrote back, "Jefferson is currently standing at the east fence looking smug. I'll tell him he was useful." What passed between them in those months was something that neither of them would have been able to name precisely, but that both of them felt clearly. The particular intimacy that comes from showing a person the small, unglamorous, daily texture of your life and having them show you theirs in return. It was more revealing, in its way, than any number of conversations about hopes and values and dreams. You could compose those conversations. You couldn't really compose the story of the oversalted stew or the stubborn bull or the coffee drunk standing up at the window because sitting down felt too dangerous. Those things were just true. Her father improved through the summer. slowly and unevenly, in the way that recovery from such things tends to go, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and the 1 step back always arriving without warning at a moment when you'd let yourself believe the forward momentum was going to hold. By July, he could hold a full conversation on most days. By August, he was walking the length of the apartment without assistance. The doctors used words like encouraging and remarkable for his age, which Margaret translated in her letters to Gideon as, "He's not going to be what he was before, but he might be something close to functional, and that's more than I expected to say 3 months ago." What she didn't write, not directly, not until September, was what this meant for the question that had been sitting between them, unasked and unanswered, for 8 months. The September letter arrived on a Thursday. Gideon was in the middle of the fall cattle work, which left him tired enough in the evenings that he sometimes fell asleep in the chair at his desk without meaning to. He read the letter at the table with his hands still dirty because he'd been in too much of a hurry to wash them properly. "I've been thinking about something for weeks, and I keep finding reasons not to write it down, which is how I know I need to. My father is well enough that he doesn't need me the way he did. Mrs. Purcell has a niece who's looking for a room and some additional income, and she's willing to check on him in the mornings and evenings. He hates the idea, but he said he won't stand in the way. So there's nothing stopping me except myself, and I've been spending a lot of time lately examining what that means. The honest thing is this: I'm afraid. I don't think I've admitted that to you clearly before, and I should have. I'm afraid of the prairie and what I don't understand about it. I'm afraid of showing up and being wrong about who you are. I'm afraid of you being wrong about who I am. 2 years of letters is a long time, and also not very long at all, depending on how you measure it. I know what you think about Jefferson the Bull and bad stew and Kansas storms. I don't know how you are when something goes genuinely wrong. I don't know what you sound like when you're angry. I don't know if we can stand to be in the same room for more than an hour. I also know that I'm 27 years old, and I'm drinking my coffee standing up every morning, and I'm setting type for other people's words all day and going home to a 3-room apartment that smells like medicine, and I think about 2 chairs on a porch I've never seen more often than I think about anything else in my life. Tell me what you think I should do." He read it twice, then he set it down and stared at the opposite wall for several minutes. He picked up his pen and wrote back without drafting at first, which was unusual for him. Sometimes the right thing to say was the thing that came out before you had time to think about it carefully enough to ruin it. "I think you should come," he wrote. "Not because the prairie isn't frightening or because I'm certain about everything. I'm not. You're right that there are things we don't know about each other. You're right that I might disappoint you in ways neither of us can anticipate right now. I might have habits that drive you to distraction. You might find that the silence out here is not the kind of silence you wanted. These are real possibilities, and I won't pretend they aren't. But here is what I know. You have been the most honest person I have ever corresponded with. In 2 years, you have not once told me what you thought I wanted to hear instead of what was actually true. That is not a small thing. That is a rare thing. And I think that whatever we don't know about each other yet, the foundation under it is solid. I think we are the kind of people who can figure out the rest. The second chair is still on the porch. It's been there for 2 years. It's not going anywhere. Come." He sent it the next morning before he could reconsider it. Then he waited, which was the part he had never gotten good at. October arrived with a cold that had teeth in it, and with Anders Bjornsson materializing at the fence line with the particular frequency that indicated he was monitoring the situation and had opinions he was restraining himself from sharing, which for Anders was a meaningful effort. "Anything?" Anders said one morning in early October, nodding toward the house in a way that somehow communicated the entire context of the past 2 years, without requiring any additional explanation. "I'm waiting," Gideon said. "You've been waiting." "I have." Anders was quiet for a moment. Then, "Ingrid's cousin in Osborne. The one who showed me your notice in the paper last year. She's mentioned you. She thinks you're Anders. I'm just saying." "I know what you're saying," Gideon said. "The answer is no." Anders sighed with his whole body, the deep Scandinavian sigh of a man who believes he is surrounded by unnecessarily complicated people. "How long are you going to wait?" "As long as it takes," Gideon said, and meant it in the way he'd meant very few things in his life. Completely, without reservation, without the small interior asterisk that qualified most declarations. Anders looked at him. Something in Gideon's expression apparently settled the question, because Anders just nodded once, the way he nodded when he'd received information and was filing it away. "All right," he said, "come for supper on Sunday. Astrid is making something with pork." "I'll be there," Gideon said. The letter he'd been waiting for arrived the second week of October, on a Tuesday, brought out from Stockton by the same route as before. The post, then Ingrid, then the fence line. He was aware, reading his name on the envelope in that precise compositor's hand, that his heart was doing something irregular and undignified, which he would not have admitted to anyone. He opened it. "All right," it said. "I'm coming. I've booked passage on the Kansas Pacific from Philadelphia to Stockton. I arrive November 14th at 2:15 in the afternoon, assuming the schedule holds, which, from what I understand about Western rail travel, it may not. I've given notice at the print shop. I've arranged for Mrs. Purcell's niece. I've told my father, who said, and I'm quoting him exactly, 'About time.' I don't know whether to find that comforting or alarming. I'm bringing 2 trunks. One has practical things. One has books, which you should know about me if you don't already. The books come with me. That's not negotiable. I'm afraid. I said it before and I'll say it again because it's still true. But I've decided that being afraid of the right things is different from being afraid of the wrong ones. And this, you, the chair, whatever this is the right thing to be afraid of. The things worth doing usually are. I'll see you on November 14th. Margaret." He read it 3 times. Then he stood up from the table, put on his coat, walked out to the porch, and sat down in his chair. The October air was cold and the sky was the particular hard blue of late autumn, cloudless and enormous. He looked at the empty chair beside him. He looked at it for a long time. Then he went inside and started a list of everything that needed to be done before November 14th. The floor, for one thing. He was going to put in a proper floor before she arrived. Check. The next 4 weeks were the busiest of his life, which was saying something for a man who had spent 4 years homesteading. He finished the interior walls in the main room first, filling the gaps between the boards, making the space actually weatherproof rather than theoretically so. He laid a wood floor in 2 of the 3 rooms, working by lamplight on the evenings when the days weren't long enough, his back aching by the end of each session in the way that 45-year-old work was already beginning to assert itself on his 31-year-old body. He finished mortaring the fireplace. He hung proper curtains on the south windows, bought them in Stockton rather than making them, which felt like a concession to practicality rather than incompetence. He built 2 more pieces of furniture that the house actually needed, a proper table for the main room that could seat 4 instead of the small workbench he'd been eating at, and a proper wardrobe for the bedroom because he understood dimly that 2 people required more storage than 1, and he wanted to have that ready rather than be confronted with its absence on arrival. Anders came over one Saturday afternoon in early November and stood in the doorway of the main room looking at the transformation with an expression that was unreadable for about 30 seconds before he said, "What does mean?" Gideon said, not stopping what he was doing, which was fitting the last section of floorboard along the wall. "It means it looks like a house," Anders said. "It looks like someone actually lives here." "Someone does actually live here. You know what I mean." Anders moved into the room, which he'd never fully entered before because the state of it had previously given him the look of a man walking into a space he found concerning. He ran a hand along the new table, which was solid maple, a good piece of work. "She's going to arrive and think you've been living like this all along." "That's fine," Gideon said. "I'm not trying to deceive her about anything important." "A dirt floor isn't important?" "I finished the floor," Gideon said, gesturing at the floor. Anders made the noise again. Then he said, unexpectedly, "Are you nervous?" Gideon set down his hammer. He thought about lying, then thought about who he was talking to and said, "Yes." "Good," Anders said, which was not the response Gideon had expected. "Good? If you weren't nervous, you wouldn't be taking it seriously." Anders picked up Gideon's hammer, examined it, set it down. "My Astrid came from Minnetonka in the winter of '71. She'd never been more than 40 miles from where she was born. She arrived in the middle of a January cold snap, and the wagon that was supposed to meet her had broken down, so she waited at the stage stop for 2 hours in weather that would have turned most men back east on the next train." He paused. She still tells that story. She tells it like it was funny. But she says the reason she didn't leave was that she decided before she got on the stage that she wasn't going to. Margaret's like that, Gideon said, and realized as he said it that he knew this to be true, completely and without uncertainty, even though he'd never been in the same room as the woman. Then you'll be all right, Anders said, in the tone of a man delivering a verdict. He picked up his coat from where he'd draped it over the back of a chair. Come for supper tonight. Astrid made bread. Gideon went. He ate bread and stew at Anders' table with Ingrid and the two younger Bjornsson boys and Astrid, who was a small Danish woman who had strong opinions about everything and the particular warmth of someone who had built something real out of hard materials. She watched Gideon across the table with an expression that was kind and evaluating in equal measure. She's going to find it strange, Astrid said near the end of the meal, without preamble. No matter how many letters you've written, she's going to arrive and everything is going to be strange. I know, Gideon said. Don't try to fix the strangeness too fast. Let it be strange. It takes time. How long did it take? For you. Astrid considered this seriously, which Gideon appreciated. She didn't give the comfortable answer. 6 months before I stopped dreaming about Minnetonka, she said. A year before I stopped feeling like a visitor in my own house. 2 years before this started feeling like mine. She looked at him steadily. It was worth it, but that's what it cost. He drove home under a sky that had gone deeply cold, the stars fierce and close overhead, and sat on his porch in his coat for a while before going inside. Both chairs were there, as they had always been. He had moved them inside during the worst of the weather, and then moved them back out when the days turned reasonable again. They had accumulated a light weathering. The wood had darkened slightly. The surface was no longer quite as smooth, but they were still solid, still level, still themselves. He sat in his chair. He looked at the one beside him, 14 days. He went inside, banked the fire, and went to bed. He did not sleep well, but he hadn't expected to. The morning of November 14th arrived with a pale sky and a north wind that was not quite cold enough to be vicious, but was making an effort. Gideon was up before sunrise, which was not unusual, but he was dressed by full light, which was earlier than he normally needed to be anywhere. The train was not due until 2:15 in the afternoon. Stockton was an hour and 15 minutes by wagon on good roads, and the roads were good. He had 4 hours to kill. He checked on the cattle, which didn't need checking. He went over the house again, looking for things he'd missed, finding nothing he hadn't already addressed. He stood in the main room for several minutes, looking at the table and the chairs around it, and the curtains on the windows and the floor that was no longer dirt, and tried to see it through the eyes of someone who was arriving here for the first time. From a city, from a life of brick and cobblestones and the smell of printing ink. He couldn't do it. He'd looked at this space for too long to see it freshly. He hitched the wagon at 11, which was an hour earlier than he needed to, and then unhitched it and went to check on Jefferson, who was in his usual location near the east fence, looking precisely as stubborn as he always looked. "This is the day," Gideon told him. Jefferson looked at him with the expression of an animal who had decided not to form opinions about human emotional states. "I know," Gideon said. "You're right. It's ridiculous." He hitched the wagon again and drove to Stockton. The train was 23 minutes late, which was better than he'd feared. He stood on the platform with his hat in his hands because he'd taken it off when the train came into view and hadn't quite figured out what to do with it since. Around him, the small station crowd, a handful of people meeting freight, a man from the land office, two cowboys passing through, went about their business with the complete indifference of people who had no idea that something significant was happening. The train slowed. Steam came in hard off the wheels, and then the first passengers were stepping off, and then more. And then he saw two trunks being handed down from a baggage car, and then he saw her. She was not what he'd imagined, which he supposed was inevitable. He'd had 2 years of letters and no image to attach them to, and so his mind had constructed something. A composite pulled from suggestions in her words, probably not accurate in any particular. What he saw was a woman in a dark traveling coat, her hair pinned under a practical hat, carrying a leather bag that looked heavy, picking her way down the platform steps with the careful deliberateness of someone who was paying attention to where she was putting her feet. She was not looking around in the wide-eyed way of someone encountering the frontier for the first time. She was looking at the ground, and then at the platform, and then at the station building, methodically, taking inventory. Then she looked up and found him, because he was standing where he'd said he'd be standing, at the north end of the platform, by the freight window. They looked at each other across about 30 feet of platform. She looked exactly like a person who had been up since before dawn after not sleeping very well, who had been on a train for 2 days and was trying very hard to appear composed and was mostly succeeding. There was a tightness around her eyes that he recognized from his own mirror on mornings when he was managing something difficult, and her jaw was set in a way that was either determination or apprehension, or probably both. He walked toward her. She didn't move, but she also didn't look away. He stopped about 4 feet away. The wind was doing something with a loose piece of station signage that made a faint, irregular knocking sound. "You're taller than I thought," she said. He stopped. He'd been about to say something that would have sounded like a compliment and landed like an observation, which was not the right first thing to say. He started again. "How was the train?" "Long," she said, "and then longer." She looked past him at the wagon. "That's yours?" "Yes." "All right." She turned toward where the trunks had been set down on the platform. "The heavy one needs 2 people." "I've got it," he said, and went to get the trunks. They loaded the wagon in a silence that was not comfortable but was not hostile either. The particular silence of 2 people who have run out of the language they prepared in advance and haven't yet found the language that comes from actually being in the same place. He helped her up onto the wagon seat, which she accepted without comment. He climbed up on the other side. He picked up the reins. "It's about an hour and a quarter," he said. "You told me," she said. "Right." They drove north out of Stockton. The prairie opened up around them the way it always did when you left town. Gradually at first, the buildings thinning out, the space between things growing, and then all at once the town was behind them, and there was nothing in any direction but land and sky. The wind came in from the north, steady and cold, and the grass along the road edges moved in long, continuous waves. He watched her from the corner of his eye. She was looking at it, not with alarm, not with wonder, with the careful, assessing look she'd probably given everything new in her life. The look of someone making an accurate inventory rather than an emotional one. After about 20 minutes, she said, "It's bigger than I thought." "The sky or the land?" "Both." A pause. "I knew it would be. I read about it. But knowing and—" She didn't finish the sentence. "Yeah," he said. They drove on. The silence this time was different, marginally easier, the kind that comes after 2 people have said one honest thing to each other in the same physical space. "I brought 43 books," she said after a while. "I know. You said 2 trunks. One trunk is all books. The other has everything else." She glanced at him. "That's a lot of books." "I built shelves last week," he said. She looked at him. "You didn't mention that." "I wanted it to be there when you arrived." She looked back at the road. He couldn't see her expression from the angle. The wagon wheels turned on the packed earth, and the wind pushed at them from the north, and the light was going gold and low in the way that late November afternoons did out here, turning the grass the color of old copper. "Tell me about Jefferson," she said. He told her about Jefferson. By the time they turned onto his property road, the worst of the silence had gone out of the air between them. Not all of it. There was still something careful and watchful in the way they were both holding themselves. The awareness of 2 people who were each trying to take in too much information at once without letting the other one see how hard they were working at it. But the worst was gone. The house came into view at the end of the road, and then the porch, and then the 2 chairs, sitting exactly where he'd left them that morning, facing east, side by side. He felt rather than saw her go still beside him. He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house. He climbed down, went around, helped her down. She stood in the yard, and she looked at the porch. She walked toward it without saying anything. He let her go. She went up the 2 steps, crossed the porch, and stood in front of the chairs. She stood there for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then she sat down, not in his chair, in the other one, the one that had been empty for 2 years. She sat in it, and she looked east, where the prairie ran on until it met a sky going orange and purple at the edges, and she put her hands in her lap, and she was quiet. He stayed where he was in the yard and watched her, and he did not say anything either, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't make the moment smaller than it was. After a while she said without turning, "It's a good chair." I made it the same night I made mine, he said. I know, you told me. She was quiet again, then, you were right about the view. He walked up the porch steps. He sat down in his chair. They sat side by side, facing east, watching the Kansas sky do what it always did, put on a show that nobody had asked for, and that was better than anything you could have planned. Neither of them said anything for a long time. The wind had dropped. The temperature was dropping with it, and it was going to be genuinely cold before the hour was out. Eventually, she was going to need to go inside and see the house for the first time, and there was going to be supper to make and trunks to unload and all the ordinary machinery of life to set in motion, and none of it was going to be easy or smooth or without its own particular difficulties. But right now, there were 2 chairs on a porch, and both of them were occupied, and the sky was doing something unreasonable above the Kansas prairie, and Gideon Hale sat in his chair and felt, for the first time in longer than he could precisely remember, that the shape of things was right. The first morning was the hardest. Margaret woke before dawn in an unfamiliar room with unfamiliar sounds pressing in through the walls. The particular creak of a house settling in the cold, the wind finding the places it could get through despite Gideon's careful work, the distant low of cattle that she'd never heard as anything but a distant and abstract sound, and now were simply there, 50 yards from where she slept, as real and immediate as anything she'd ever known. The room was dark in a way that city rooms never were. No gas lamps on the street outside, no light from neighboring windows, nothing at all except the faint gray beginning of something that might eventually become morning seeping under the door from the direction of the main room where Gideon had already apparently been up for some time. She lay on her back on the bed that was not her bed, in the room that was not her room, and she stared at the ceiling she could barely see, and she thought, I have done an enormous thing and I cannot undo it. That was not quite panic. She'd felt panic before. The morning the foreman at the print shop told her the owner wanted to see her about a complaint a customer had made. The day she'd gotten the telegram about her father. And this wasn't that. Panic had a specific physical quality, a narrowing, a sense of being trapped. This was different. This was more like standing at the edge of something very large and feeling the full weight of the distance between where she was standing and the bottom, while also understanding that she'd already stepped off and was now simply in the process of falling. And falling was what was happening, and there was nothing left to do but fall well. She got up. The floor was cold under her feet. She dressed quickly, the way she'd learned to dress in the apartment on Chestnut Street where the landlady kept the heat at a level that was technically above freezing and not much more. She found her boots, laced them. She stood in the middle of the room for a moment, her breath faintly visible, and then she opened the door. Gideon was at the stove. He'd built the fire up, and the main room was substantially warmer than the bedroom, and he was making coffee in the way of a man who had been making his own coffee for so long. He did it without thinking, measuring by eye, moving efficiently without hurrying. He heard her come out and looked up. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said. There was a pause of several seconds in which both of them understood that the previous evening, the porch, the chairs, the strange quiet peace of sitting beside each other while the sky went dark, had not resolved anything about the practical reality of being 2 people who did not know each other's habits yet, living in the same house, and that the day was now officially starting. "Coffee's almost done," he said. "Thank you." She sat down at the table. He set a cup in front of her when the coffee was ready, and then he stood at the window with his own cup the way she'd told him she stood at her window in Philadelphia, and she wasn't sure if he remembered telling her that and was doing it deliberately or if it was just what he did, but either way, she noticed it. They drank their coffee. Outside the window, the prairie was beginning to emerge from the dark, the flat line of the horizon sharpening against a sky that was going from black to deep blue. There was frost on the grass. "What do you need to do today?" she asked. "Cattle first," he said. "Then I need to check the north fence before the ground freezes too hard. Probably 3 or 4 hours of outside work." He looked at her. "You don't have to do anything today. You just got here." "I'm not built for doing nothing," she said. "Tell me what needs doing inside." He told her. It was a straightforward list, the kind of household work that accumulated when one person had been managing a space alone, with all the gaps and compromises that implied. She absorbed it without comment, and when he'd finished his coffee and put on his coat and gone out, she started on it. The first week was a study in mutual awkwardness, which was what Astrid Bjornson had predicted and which being prepared for did not make significantly easier. They were two people with established habits sharing a space that had previously accommodated only one set of habits, and the friction was constant and mostly small. He was up earlier than she was. She reorganized things, the kitchen especially, where his system of storage was purely spatial memory rather than any logical order, and he had to actively stop himself from moving things back out of habit. She burned 2 meals in the first 4 days because the stove ran hotter than the one she was used to, and she was furious with herself each time in the contained, private way of someone who considers incompetence at ordinary tasks a personal failing. He ate both meals without complaint, which she recognized intellectually as the right thing for him to do and which irritated her anyway, though she couldn't entirely explain why. There were also moments that were unexpectedly easy. She discovered on the 3rd day that he read in the evenings, not the agricultural newspapers and almanacs she might have expected, but actual books, a small shelf of them in the back room that included 2 Shakespeare plays, a history of the Louisiana Territory, a collection of essays she recognized from their reputation, and, somewhat surprisingly, a battered copy of Jane Eyre that looked like it had been read more than once. She stood in front of that shelf for a long moment. "You read Jane Eyre?" she said when he came inside that evening. "3 times, he said, without particular defensiveness. "Why?" He took off his coat, hung it up, thought about the question with the seriousness he gave to questions he thought deserved it. "She knows what she wants," he finally said, "and she doesn't pretend she doesn't." Margaret looked at him. He went to wash his hands at the basin, and she looked at the shelf of books for another moment, and then she went to the trunk that held her own 43 and started unpacking them onto the shelves he'd built, which were not quite long enough for all of them, which meant she'd need to talk to him about adding another section, which turned out to be the most comfortable conversation they'd had yet. The question of the marriage itself had not been formally raised since she'd arrived, which was a peculiarity both of them were aware of and neither had directly addressed. He had not assumed anything, and she had not offered anything, and the sleeping arrangement was the one that had emerged naturally from the shape of the house and the absence of any alternative. Her in the bedroom, him on the narrow bunk in the back room that he'd been using for 2 years, which was cramped but functional and which he treated with complete matter-of-factness, as if this were a temporary arrangement whose duration would be decided when it was decided and not before. It was Astrid who brought it up, inevitably. She arrived on the 4th day with bread and a kind of casual authority that suggested she'd decided it was time to check on the situation, which it was. Gideon was outside and Astrid sat at the table with Margaret and drank coffee and looked at the reorganized kitchen with what might have been approval. "How are you finding it?" Astrid asked. "Strange," Margaret said. "You said it would be." "I did." Astrid wrapped both hands around her cup. "And him?" "Strange too," Margaret said. "But not wrong. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," Astrid said. "Strange and wrong are different things. Strange goes away. Wrong doesn't." Margaret nodded. She turned her cup in her hands. "I need to ask you something that I can't ask him yet." "All right. The women out here, the married ones, what are they actually... How much of the work is..." She stopped, regrouped. "I was a compositor for 7 years. I had a salary. I had a skill. I made decisions. I'm trying to understand what I'm coming into, whether there's room in this life for that person or whether she gets put away." Astrid was quiet for a moment, long enough that Margaret wondered if she'd asked the wrong thing in the wrong way. "It depends on the man," Astrid finally said. "Some men out here, the woman disappears." "That's true. But you've read his letters for 2 years. Do you think that's him?" "No," Margaret said without hesitating. "Then don't start by assuming it is," Astrid said. "The women who have the hardest time out here are the ones who arrive already fighting a battle that hasn't started yet." She looked at Margaret steadily. "But ask him. Don't wonder about it. Ask him." Margaret asked him that evening, at supper, in the direct way she had of doing things she'd decided to do. Without preamble, without softening, because softening things was a habit she'd never acquired and didn't intend to start. "I need to know what you expect of me," she said. He looked up from his plate. "Not generally," she said. "Specifically. I'm not going to be a person who manages a house and nothing else. I'm not built for it, and I don't think you want that anyway, but I need to hear you say it." He set down his fork. He thought about it. She could see him thinking about it, not performing thought but actually doing it, which was one of the things she'd identified about him in the letters, and was finding to be equally true in person. He didn't answer quickly because he wanted to make sure he answered right. I put an advertisement in 3 newspapers, he said, that said specifically I didn't want a housekeeper or a decoration. I meant that. I want someone who thinks, who has opinions about how things are done and argues with me when she thinks I'm wrong. I built this place alone for 4 years, and there are things I haven't done well because I only had one way of looking at them. He paused. I need a partner. I meant that word when I wrote it. She held his look for a moment. All right, she said. Then I want to understand the finances. All of it. What you own, what you owe, what comes in and what goes out. Not because I think you've been careless, because I can't think about how to improve something I don't understand. He got up, went to the desk in the back room, and came back with a ledger book that he laid open on the table in front of her. Start anywhere, he said. She started at the beginning. They sat at the table until well past the point when they would normally have gone to bed, and he answered every question she asked, and she asked more questions than he had answers for, which revealed, among other things, that his pricing strategy for the cattle sales had been leaving money on the table in ways that were easily correctable, and that his relationship with the grain merchant in Stockton could probably be renegotiated if someone were willing to make the case, and that case was one she could see the shape of clearly enough to sketch it out on the back of an old invoice. He looked at what she'd written and was quiet for a moment. That's right, he said. I know, she said. Something shifted in the room, not dramatically. It wasn't a dramatic moment. It was a quiet one, the kind that doesn't announce its own importance. But the shape of the thing between them changed, became more solid, settled into something that resembled what he'd described in his advertisement and what she'd responded to. A partnership, an actual one. They married 3 weeks after her arrival, on a Thursday morning in December, at the county seat in Stockton, in the company of Anders and Astrid Bjornson and the county clerk who had performed this function enough times that he moved through it efficiently without quite losing the sense that it mattered. The ceremony took 11 minutes. Margaret wore her best dress, which was dark blue wool and was warm enough for the December cold, which she'd prioritized over anything more ceremonially appropriate. Gideon wore the coat he'd had cleaned specifically for the occasion. He had also, she noticed, cut his hair, which was shorter than she'd seen it in the brief weeks she'd known him, and made him look younger and slightly uncertain in a way that she found unexpectedly endearing, Anders cried, which no one commented on, least of all Astrid, who handed him a handkerchief without looking at him. They drove back to the ranch in the wagon, the same road she'd traveled on her first day here, when everything had been strange and enormous. The prairie looked different now, still big, still cold, still indifferent in the way she'd identified early. But she knew more of it now. She knew the names of the things she could see, the kinds of grasses, and the way the light moved across them at different hours. She knew which direction the worst weather came from and what the sky looked like before it arrived. She knew that the east fence needed ongoing monitoring and that Jefferson, despite his reputation, had actually come up to the fence and breathed on her hand one morning in a way she'd classified as tentative friendliness, though she hadn't told Gideon this because he would have been insufferably pleased about it. She was not yet at home here, but she was beginning to learn the address. When they got back to the ranch, Gideon went inside to tend the fire, which had been banked low while they were gone and needed rebuilding. Margaret went to the porch. She sat in her chair. The December air was cold, and the sky was the thin pale blue of winter, cloudless, the sun already moving toward the southwestern horizon at 2 in the afternoon. The grass was silver-brown, the same colors it had been when she arrived, and the land ran flat in every direction until it simply stopped at the sky. She had made an enormous and irreversible choice. She had left a city, a job, a life built over 26 years, and she had come here and married a man whose handwriting she had known before she knew his face. The rational case for this decision was, when she examined it honestly, not airtight. It had a logic, but that logic depended on a number of things being true that she could not have verified in advance. She sat in her chair and breathed the cold air and looked at the prairie and examined herself, clinically, the way she examined everything. She did not regret it. That was not a small thing to know. She'd been afraid that when the moment came to actually examine the feeling honestly, She'd find something she'd been refusing to look at, some layer of doubt or loss or wrong decision underneath the surface of having made up her mind. But it wasn't there. She was afraid of various things. She was uncertain about various things. She was struggling with various things. She was not regretting this. Gideon came to the door. "Fire's up," he said. "I'm coming," she said, but didn't move immediately. He came and sat in his chair. They sat beside each other in the December cold for a few minutes, which had become, in 3 weeks, something like a habit. The particular quality of the silence between them had changed considerably since the first night. It was less like two people being careful with each other and more like two people who had discovered that they could share silence without it needing to be filled, which was its own form of trust. "I've been thinking about the library," she said. He waited. "There's no school within reasonable distance of here," she said. "I've asked around, the Bjornson children, the Hartley children, the 2 families on the North Road. They're getting almost no formal education." "I know," he said. "I want to start a lending library. At the house first, then somewhere more central, if it grows." She turned to look at him. "I have 43 books. It's a start." He was quiet for a moment. "You'd need a catalog system," he said. "Some way to track what goes out and comes back." "Obviously," she said. "The back room has space if we reorganize it." "I know. I've been measuring." He looked at her. Something crossed his face that she was learning to identify. Not quite amusement, not quite admiration, something that sat between those things and was more specific than either. "When did you start planning this?" he asked. "Second week," she said. "I needed something to solve." He nodded slowly. "You should come with me to the county gathering next month," he said. "There'll be 20 families there at least. You could talk to the women, find out what they actually need, not just what you think they need." She considered this. "That's a good point. I have them occasionally," he said. She stood up from the chair and went inside, and he followed, and the door closed on the December cold and the silver grass and the 2 chairs that stayed on the porch, occupied now by weather and wind and the particular companionship of empty things that have found their purpose and are waiting patiently for the next time they're needed. The winter was hard. That was simply true. The hardest stretch came in January and February, when a series of storms moved through Rooks County with enough severity that they lost 5 head of cattle to the cold despite everything they did to prevent it, and the well froze twice in the same week, and there was a period of 4 days when neither of them could get to Stockton, and they were entirely dependent on what was in the house. The 4 days in the house together, unable to go anywhere, doing small tasks and trying not to get in each other's way, in a space that was not large, revealed more about both of them than all the weeks preceding it. She discovered that he was short-tempered when he was frustrated and didn't like to admit it. That when something wasn't working, the first thing he did was go at it harder rather than stepping back, and that this had a success rate that was lower than he seemed to acknowledge. She told him this on the second day of the blizzard, not diplomatically, and he looked at her for a moment with an expression that was on the near side of anger and then said, "You're probably right," and went to sit at the table and think about the problem instead. He discovered that she withdrew when she was worried, not in the emotional way he'd first read it, but in a focused, internal way, all her processing happening somewhere he couldn't see it, which left him uncertain whether she was all right or not. He said so on the 3rd day, and she looked up from what she was working on with genuine surprise. "I thought you could tell I was fine," she said. "I can't always tell," he said. She thought about this. "I'll tell you when I'm not," she said. "That would help," he said. On the 4th day, when the storm broke and the light came back hard and brilliant off the snow, they both went outside at the same time without discussing it and stood in front of the house in the cold and looked at the white-covered prairie in every direction, and the air was so clear it almost hurt. "We didn't kill each other," she said. "Close thing," he said. She laughed. It came out a little rough, the laugh of someone who doesn't do it as often as they might. And he turned to look at her when she did it because it was the first time he'd heard her laugh like that. Not politely or briefly, but all the way. "Close thing," she agreed, and went back inside to start the fire back up. And he went to check the cattle, and the ranch went on turning itself back toward function. And the 2 of them went on figuring out, imperfectly and without much grace, but with considerable genuine effort, what it meant to build something together out of cold weather and hard soil, and two people who were both too stubborn to do this halfway. By the time the first spring thaw came and the ground began to give again under their feet, something had settled in the house that hadn't been there in November. It wasn't comfort exactly. It was something less easy than that, more like structure, the thing that exists between two people who have been through a hard season together and come out the other side still choosing each other. Not because the choice was simple, not because they'd discovered they were perfectly suited in every way that mattered, but because they'd looked at the evidence of the winter and neither of them had found a reason to want something different. Margaret moved her books into the back room in March and started the lending system she'd been planning since December. A catalog written in her compositor's hand, neat and precise, with a numbering system that Gideon said was more sophisticated than was strictly necessary for 43 books. "It's going to be more than 43 books," she said. He didn't argue with that. She was right, and they both knew it, and knowing it together was its own quiet thing. The particular satisfaction of two people who are beginning, finally, to understand the shape of what they've built. The library grew the way things grew on the prairie. Slowly at first, then faster than you expected. Then suddenly it was just there, a fact of the landscape that was hard to imagine not having existed. By the second spring, Margaret had accumulated 81 books through a combination of her own editions, donations from families in the county who had volumes they weren't using, and a carefully worded letter she'd sent to a publisher in Chicago explaining the situation and asking if they had any damaged or surplus inventory they'd be willing to part with at reduced cost. The publisher had written back with more warmth than she'd anticipated and sent a crate of 37 volumes, some with bent spines, one with water damage along the lower corner, all of them readable, along with a note saying they'd be happy to continue the arrangement annually. She showed Gideon the note over supper, and he read it twice. "You wrote a publisher," he said. "I wrote several," she said. "He's the only one who wrote back." "What did you say in the letter?" "The truth," she said, "that there are families out here with children who have no access to books, and that this is a correctable problem, and that I intended to correct it." He handed the letter back. "You didn't ask," he said. "You told them." "Asking invites negotiation," she said. "Telling invites action." He looked at her across the table with that expression she'd come to know well by now, the one that sat between amusement and something more serious. "You were wasted in that print shop," he said. "I wasn't wasted," she said. "I was waiting." The back room was no longer the storage space it had been. She'd reorganized it completely over the winter. Shelves on 3 walls, a small table in the center with 2 chairs where people could sit and read if they needed to, a catalog ledger on the table that now ran to 40 pages in her precise hand. The first families had come tentatively, the Hartleys and the Lindquists and the Moores from the North Road, mothers mostly, arriving at the ranch house on Saturday mornings with their children and an expression that mixed uncertainty with something that looked, underneath, like hunger. She hadn't made it formal or ceremonial. She'd shown them the shelves, explained the catalog, told them to take what they wanted for 2 weeks and bring it back. The children were the ones who undid her composure the first time, though she wouldn't have admitted it. A girl named Clara Hartley, 9 years old, with her mother's worn coat and her father's serious eyes, had stood in front of the shelves for 10 full minutes without touching anything, just looking, and then she'd turned to Margaret and asked, very quietly, if she was allowed to touch the books. "That's what they're here for," Margaret had said. Clara had taken down a collection of illustrated natural history and held it against her chest with both arms, as if it might be taken away. And Margaret had gone to find Gideon on some invented errand because she didn't want anyone to see her face just then. She told him about it that evening, in the dark, matter-of-factly, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "We need a bigger room." "Eventually," she said. "Not eventually," he said. "Next fall. I'll build an addition." She was quiet for a moment. "That's not a small thing." "No," he said. "It's not." He built the addition the following September, with Anders's help and the assistance of 2 other men from the county who showed up on the first day with tools and no prior announcement, which was how things got done in Rooks County when people decided something mattered. It took 3 weekends. The room was larger than the original back room, with windows on 2 sides and enough wall space for the library to double what it currently held, which at the rate Margaret was acquiring books, it would need to do within a year. The children came from farther away after that. Word moved through the county the way it always did, by wagon and by word of mouth, and by the particular efficiency of women who understood which information needed to travel quickly and made sure it did. Margaret started a reading hour on Saturday mornings. Not a formal lesson, she was careful to call it that, because formal implied school and school implied authority she hadn't been granted by anyone. It was simply an hour where children who came to the library could sit and listen to someone read aloud, and she would answer questions afterward about what they'd heard. The questions were consistently the best part of her week. Gideon came to the reading hour once in the early months, standing in the doorway so he wouldn't take up a chair. He watched her handle a question from a 12-year-old boy named Thomas More, who wanted to know why the Romans had fallen, and he watched her take the question completely seriously, not talk down to it, and give an answer that was accurate and honest and didn't pretend the world was simpler than it was. Then she turned the question around and asked Thomas what he thought, and Thomas had said something that wasn't entirely wrong, and Margaret had said so, specifically, not with the vague encouragement adults usually offered children, but with precision. That part is right. This part needs more thought. Here's why. Thomas More went home that day and told his father he wanted to be a lawyer. His father, a quiet man named Russell Moore, who ran a small spread 2 miles north, came to the ranch the following week to talk to Gideon. "My boy," Russell said, in the manner of a man not entirely sure how to frame what he was trying to say. "He's talking about law school." "I heard," Gideon said. "He's 12. Margaret was 26 when she decided to come to Kansas, Gideon said. "Decisions made when you're young sometimes stick better than ones you make later." Russell thought about this. He was a careful man, not given to quick conclusions. "She's something," he finally said, nodding toward the house. "She is," Gideon agreed. "You wrote that notice in the paper," Russell said. It wasn't a question. The story of the advertisement and the 2 chairs had become something the county knew, in the way that counties know things, set partially, with some detail accurate and some embellished and some simply invented to fill the gaps. "I did," Gideon said. Russell nodded slowly. "Smart thing," he said. "I had a specific idea," Gideon said. I got lucky that it worked." "That's not luck," Russell said. "Luck is when something happens to you. You made that happen." Gideon didn't argue with it. He'd thought about this enough over the years, the question of what had been intention and what had been fortune, to have arrived at the conclusion that the distinction was probably less important than simply being grateful the chairs were both occupied, and he left it there. The drought came in the summer of 1883, and it came without mercy. The first sign was the rain not arriving when it should have, which was April. They'd had dry Aprils before. Not common, but not unprecedented. And neither Gideon nor any of his neighbors interpreted it immediately as disaster. May came in dry too, and that was the point at which Gideon started checking the sky with a frequency that was no longer routine. June went by without significant rain. July arrived with heat that settled over the prairie like something physical, like pressure, and the grass that had been bending in its usual rhythms went from green gold to brown to something approaching gray in the space of 6 weeks. The Lindquists lost their wheat in July. The Hartley family lost theirs in August. By September, there were 3 families in the county who were genuinely in danger, not of being uncomfortable, but of not having enough food to make it through the winter, which was a different kind of crisis entirely, and one that Margaret and Gideon had been watching develop with a growing alarm that they discussed every evening at the table with the ledger open between them. "We're all right," Gideon said one evening in September, which was true. Their cattle operation had insulated them somewhat. Beef prices had held, and they had enough in reserve from the previous 2 good years that the immediate crisis was not their own. "The Lindquists are not." "I know," Margaret said. She'd been doing calculations on a separate piece of paper, a column of numbers that represented what they had and what they could spare without endangering themselves. "We can give them enough grain to get through February, maybe March, if it's rationed carefully. We can give it, or we can sell it to them at a reduced price," Gideon said. "Anders was saying Eric Lindquist won't take charity." "Anders is right," Margaret said. "He won't. So we sell it to him at a price that is technically accurate, but low enough to be manageable. And we don't call it anything other than a transaction." She paused. "And we talked to Russell Moore and the Bjornsons about the Hartleys. The Hartleys have 4 children, and their situation is worse." Gideon looked at her across the table. She was 30 years old now, and the years on the prairie had changed the surface of her in ways she was mostly unbothered by. Her hands had roughened, there were lines around her eyes from squinting in the prairie sun, and she'd stopped caring about her hair entirely except for the matter of keeping it out of her way while she worked. The person underneath was recognizably the same as the one who'd written him careful, precise, slightly combative letters from Philadelphia, but the combativeness had found its targets, was directed outward now, at problems, at deficiencies in the world, at things that were wrong and could be made less wrong if someone was willing to think it through and do the work. He'd never told her how much he admired this. He showed it in the way he agreed with her plans and stayed out of her way when she was executing them and backed her decisions in front of other people. He wasn't sure he had the right words for the rest of it. "You've already talked to Astrid," he said. "Yesterday," she said, "while you were in Stockton." "And?" "Astrid is bringing food. She wants to be the one to take it to the Hartleys because Clara comes to the library and she thinks Clara's mother will accept it from her before she'd accept it from me." Margaret made a mark in the ledger. "She's probably right." "You're going to organize the whole county through a drought," Gideon said. "Someone has to," she said, without looking up. He wanted to say something that conveyed the thing he felt, which was large and didn't have a simple name. Instead, he said, "You're going to need help with the Saturday readings while this is happening. You can't do everything." She looked up. "I know. I was thinking about Clara's older sister. She's 15 and she's read everything in the library at least once. She could manage it while I'm occupied." "Ask her," he said. "I already did," she said. She said yes. He laughed. It came out genuine. The laugh of a man who has stopped being surprised by his wife's capability and is simply entertained by the consistency of it. She looked at him with the expression she had when she was pretending not to be pleased by something, which was also a thing he'd come to know well. "Go check on the cattle," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said and stood up, and she went back to the ledger and the ranch went on. The drought broke in October, which was late, but not too late for the people who'd made it through. 3 families had left the county during those months, loading what they could carry and heading east with the particular expression of people who had tried a thing honestly and found it beyond them, which Gideon respected without judgment, because he knew what the prairie cost, and the people who stayed were not braver than the ones who left, only differently built. The families who stayed threw a gathering in November when the first real rain finally came, at the Moore place, which was the largest property nearby, and it was half celebration and half exhausted relief. The kind of party that happens when people have been holding tension for so long that the release of it needs somewhere to go. Gideon and Margaret drove to the Moors in the wagon on a Saturday evening and arrived to find 30 people already there, lantern light coming through the windows, the sound of someone playing a fiddle badly but enthusiastically from inside. Margaret climbed down from the wagon and stood for a moment in the evening air, which was cool and clean, with the particular freshness that followed rain, and she looked at the lit windows and the wagons in the yard and the faces of people she knew now, genuinely knew, their histories and their difficult seasons and the names of their children. 2 years ago I had never heard of Rooks County, she said. "I know," Gideon said. "I read about it in a newspaper, in Philadelphia, in a print shop that smelled like metal and heat." She was quiet for a moment. "I couldn't have told you where Kansas was on a map with any real confidence." "And now?" She looked at him. "And now I know which direction the worst weather comes from, and I know that Jefferson has finally stopped pushing on the east fence, and I know that Clara Hartley wants to be a naturalist, and that Russell Moore's wife makes the best pie in the county, and that Anders Bjornson cries at weddings but won't admit it." He waited. "It's mine," she said simply. "It took a while, but it's mine." He took her hand, which was not something they did often in public, not from lack of feeling, but from the shared quality of being people who kept the interior things interior. She didn't pull away. They went inside, and the fiddle was bad, and someone had made a punch that was stronger than advertised, and the children ran between the adult legs with the reckless energy of children who had been mostly indoors for weeks. And Clara Hartley showed Margaret a feather she'd found and identified from the natural history book she'd been carrying around since she was 9 years old. And Thomas Moore argued loudly with his father about something that had been in the newspaper. And Anders Bjornson stood in the corner with his arms crossed, pretending not to enjoy himself and manifestly enjoying himself. And Astrid caught Margaret's eye across the room, and they exchanged the look of two women who have been through a hard season together and don't need words to account for what it cost. Later that night, driving home under a sky that had cleared completely after the rain, the stars, the way they always were out here, excessive, overwhelming, the universe declining to be modest about itself. Margaret leaned against Gideon's shoulder on the wagon seat because it was cold, and they were tired, and there was no one to see, and no reason not to. "We need another shelf," she said. "In the library. I have 12 more books coming from Chicago." "I'll build it next week," he said. The horse moved steadily through the dark. The ranch came into view at the end of the road, and then the porch. And even in the dark, she could see the shapes of the two chairs where they always were, facing east. She'd started to find them comforting in a way she hadn't expected, not as a symbol of anything, just as a physical fact of her life, part of the landscape that was hers now. They had 2 children by then, a boy named James who was 2 years old and had Gideon's stubbornness and Margaret's precise dark eyes, and a girl, Eleanor, who was 4 months old and whose character was still too early to assess, but who had already demonstrated, in the opinion of everyone who met her, a very determined quality to her crying that suggested she knew exactly what she wanted and intended to have it. Gideon tied the horse and helped Margaret down, and they went inside where the banked fire still held warmth, and the children were asleep in the back room, and the library shelves lined the walls with their orderly catalog, and the ledger sat on the table where they'd left it, and none of it was perfect. The floor had a plank that creaked. The north window still let in a draft they'd never fully solved. There were roughly 10 things on Gideon's maintenance list that had been on that list for 3 months and would be on it for 3 more. But it was real, and it was theirs, and it had been built out of 2 chairs on a porch, and 2 people stubborn enough to believe that was sufficient foundation. Margaret fed Eleanor, who had woken at the sound of the door, and when the baby was settled again, she stood at the south window for a moment in the dark, not drinking coffee this time, just standing there the way she used to stand in Philadelphia, except that what she was looking at was completely different, and the person she was looking at it as was also, in the ways that mattered, completely different. Gideon came and stood beside her. They didn't say anything. Outside, the prairie was dark and wide and cold, and the stars were doing their usual unreasonable thing above it, and somewhere out there, Jefferson was standing by a fence that he had, eventually, agreed to leave alone, and the library had 89 books and a waiting list for the illustrated natural history. And Thomas More was going to be a lawyer, and Clara Hartley was going to name a bird after herself someday if Margaret had anything to say about it, and the east fence was holding, and the 2 chairs were on the porch where they had always been. The years did what years do. They accumulated without asking permission, stacking themselves one on top of another until the weight of them became the shape of a life. James grew into a serious, broad-shouldered young man with his father's hands and his mother's habit of asking the question nobody else in the room had thought to ask yet. Eleanor turned out to be exactly as determined as her early crying had suggested. She was the one who, at 16, reorganized the library catalog into a system so logical and efficient that Margaret stood in the doorway looking at it for a long time before admitting it was better than her original. Both children grew up understanding that the ranch was a thing you maintained by paying attention to it, that the library was a thing you maintained by taking it seriously, and that partnership, real partnership, the kind their parents had, looked like 2 people who disagreed regularly and productively, and neither of whom ever stopped listening to the other. The library moved out of the ranch house in 1891 into a small building that Rooks County helped fund after a proposal Margaret submitted to the county commissioners. A proposal written in the direct, evidence-based style of a woman who had spent years watching vague requests get vague responses and had long since stopped being vague. The building was modest, 2 rooms with shelves on every available wall and a reading table in the center and windows on the south side that let in good light through the afternoons. The collection by then was over 400 volumes. Clara Hartley, who was 21 and had been sending letters to university naturalists for 2 years, wrote the dedication that went above the door. It was 11 words, which was exactly the right length. Gideon was 53 when his heart started giving him trouble. He didn't mention it to Margaret immediately, which was a mistake, and which she identified within about 4 days because she was not a woman who missed things. And the conversation that followed was one of the harder ones they'd had. Not angry exactly, but with the particular tension that comes when one person has been protecting another person from information, and the other person has noticed and does not find the protection useful or welcome. "You were going to tell me when," she said. "When I knew what it was," he said. "That is not your decision alone to make." "I know," he said. "I know that. I just—" He stopped. He was sitting at the table, and she was standing across from him, and neither of them was pretending this was a small thing. "I didn't want you to worry before there was something specific to worry about." "Gideon." She sat down. She looked at him directly, the way she'd looked at him across ledgers and plans and 30 years of ordinary days. "When you are sick, I need to know. Not because I'll fall apart, because I won't, but I can't help with something I don't know is happening." He looked at his hands on the table. They were the hands of a man in his 50s who had spent his adult life doing physical work, scarred at the knuckles, thick at the palm, the kind of hands that told a story just by existing. He turned them over and looked at both sides of them, which was something she'd seen him do when he was thinking through something he didn't have ready words for. "I was afraid," he said, finally. "Not of being sick, of what it meant to you, everything we built. I didn't want you to have to start worrying about what happens if—" "I've thought about what happens," she said quietly. "I've been thinking about it since you were 40, and you fell off the north fence and scared 10 years off my life. It's not a thought I can choose not to have." She reached across the table. "So let me have it with you instead of alone." He turned his hand under hers. "All right," he said. The doctor in Stockton gave him manageable instructions and a list of things to reduce and things to stop, which Gideon complied with in the imperfect way of a man who understood the necessity but couldn't make himself care about all of it equally. He stopped the heaviest physical work and gave more of it to James, who had been effectively running the cattle operation for 2 years already and didn't need to be told how. He kept writing, kept the morning checks, kept his hand in the work because the work was the structure of his days, and removing it entirely would have cost him something that wasn't worth the trade. He and Margaret still sat on the porch in the evenings when the weather allowed, which it allowed more often than people who'd never lived on the Kansas prairie expected. The chairs had been repaired twice over the years. New back slats on his, a replaced front leg on hers, the wood re-oiled when the surface started drying out in ways that would eventually crack, but they were still the same chairs, essentially, the bones of them unchanged. They faced east, as they always had, toward whatever the morning was going to bring. The conversations on the porch had changed in texture over the decades. Early in the marriage, they'd been substantive, strategic, about the ranch and the library and the county and what needed doing. Later, they'd added the children, the way parents discuss their children when they're young, and you're constantly mid-problem, then mid-solution, then watching the solution become its own new complication. Later still, the children had grown and left, and the conversations had become something quieter, less urgent, more like the talk between people who have said the important things enough times that they don't need to say them constantly, and can afford to just be in the same space and let the silence carry some of the weight. In his last years, Gideon talked about the advertisement sometimes. Not often, maybe 4 or 5 times, in the way that a person returns to the things that still interest them even after decades. He'd think about the particular formulation he'd used, why he'd said what he said the way he said it, whether a different version of it would have reached a different person entirely, or whether Margaret was the only person who would have written back to the specific strange thing he'd tried to say. "What if you'd used different words?" Margaret asked him once, on the porch, in the particular golden light of a late September afternoon. James was running the fall cattle work. Eleanor was in Topeka, where she'd been teaching secondary school for 3 years after finishing her own education at a women's college in Ohio that the county library had, not incidentally, helped prepare her to qualify for. "What do you mean?" Gideon said. "The advertisement. If you'd written the standard version, the one that listed your assets and asked for a woman of good moral character. Would I have written back?" He thought about it seriously. He always thought about things seriously. "No," he said. "No," she agreed. "You would have seen 100 of those," he said. "You set type for papers. You'd read them enough times to know what they were." "I had read them," she said. "I'd set type for 3 of them in the same month yours ran. Standard notices. They all sounded like want ads for livestock." She looked at the prairie, which was doing the September thing, the grass going to its fall colors, amber and brown and a dark, persistent green in the low places where the moisture held. Yours sounded like a person. I was trying to, he said. You were terrible at a lot of things when I arrived, she said. The kitchen storage was genuinely irrational. You oversalted everything. You had a habit of finishing other people's sentences that took 3 years to break. I know, he said. You told me. Multiple times. Multiple times, he agreed. You were also terrible at asking for help when you needed it. You still are. You reorganize things without telling me and then act surprised when I can't find them. And you have never once admitted to being cold when you're clearly cold. I don't get cold, she said. Margaret. I run warm, she said. He looked at her with the expression he'd had for 30 years, the one between amusement and something more than amusement, and she looked back at him with her expression, which was the one that was pretending not to be pleased and wasn't entirely convincing. It was enough, he said after a moment. What was? All of it. The irrational kitchen storage, and the 30 years and the chairs. He looked east the way they both looked east when they were on the porch. It was more than enough. It was more than I knew how to want. She didn't say anything for a moment. The wind moved through the grass in the usual way, and the light went gold and long across the flat land, and the two chairs held them side by side the way they always had. The second chair was empty for a long time, she said. It was, he said. You weren't worried? I was specific, he said. There's a difference. He paused. And I was worried. I just decided to build the chair anyway. She took his hand there on the porch in the September afternoon, and they sat like that until the light went and the air got its evening chill, and she stood up and told him to come inside. Gideon Hale died in the spring of 1906, quietly, in the house he had built, in the bed he had shared with Margaret for 25 years. James was there, and Eleanor had come home from Topeka in time, and it was not without pain or difficulty, but it was not without dignity either, which was the most you could honestly ask for. He was 58 years old. The county sent a notice to the Stockton paper. The library closed for 3 days. Thomas Moore, who was in fact a lawyer by then, practicing in Salina, drove out to pay his respects. Clara Hartley, who had published 2 papers on prairie ornithology and had the kind of quiet reputation that builds when someone does their work carefully over many years, sent a letter from Lawrence that Margaret read at the table and folded and put in the desk drawer without saying what it said. Margaret was 53 years old when he died. She had not been prepared, which was not something she would have admitted out loud, because she had thought about this, had believed she had prepared herself, and discovered in the reality of it that thinking about a thing and surviving it were related but not equivalent. The first month she functioned on the structural momentum of decades of habit. The ranch still needed managing, the library still needed tending, the mornings still came whether she was ready for them or not. She drank her coffee standing at the window, the way she'd done as a young woman in Philadelphia, not because sitting down felt dangerous this time, but because standing felt like something she could control when other things didn't. James ran the cattle operation and ran it well. Eleanor stayed 3 months before returning to Topeka, which was the right decision, and which Margaret told her clearly, because Eleanor had her own life and her own work, and the world needed what Eleanor could do in it, and a mother who loved her child told her that instead of leveraging grief to keep her close, what Margaret found over the months that followed was that the grief was not what she had expected. Not a single thing, not a wall, but a presence that moved around, that showed up in unexpected places and not at all in the places she'd braced for it. She missed him most in the small moments, the ordinary ones, the times when something happened and her first impulse was to turn and tell him about it. She missed his specific laugh. She missed his face when he was thinking through something hard. She missed the weight of him in the chair beside hers on the porch, the particular quality of the silence when they sat there together. She kept sitting on the porch. That surprised her somewhat. She'd thought the porch would be the hardest, the most obvious absence. But she went back to it after 2 weeks, sat in her chair, looked at the east horizon the way they'd looked at it together for 25 years. The empty chair beside her was different now than it had been before she arrived. It wasn't anticipation anymore. Wasn't the promise of something coming. It was memory. It held a different kind of weight. She found, sitting in it, that the weight was bearable. It was almost a year after Gideon's death when she was clearing out the desk in the back room. Not getting rid of anything, just creating some order in the accumulated papers of 30 years, and she found the draft. It was in a folder that held old correspondence, tucked behind a stack of letters she recognized as her own, the ones she'd sent from Philadelphia in the early months. The draft was a single sheet, the paper yellowed and stiff with age, the handwriting unmistakably his. That particular compressed, practical script that she'd known in letters before she'd known the face that belonged to it. It was the original draft of the advertisement. An early version, more tentative than the final, with lines crossed out and words tried and rejected and tried again. She could trace, in the crossings out, the shape of what he'd been reaching for. Could see him going at it, the way he went at the problems he couldn't solve by force, backing up, circling, trying a different angle. She turned the paper over. On the back, in the same handwriting but different, the pen pressure heavier, the letters more settled, the hand of a man writing something he was sure of. There was a note. It was not dated. Based on the quality of the paper aging and the particular sureness of the pen, she thought it had been written years after the advertisement ran, but she couldn't say exactly when. It said, "She came. She sat in it." I was right about the chairs. Margaret sat at the desk in the room that had been the library before the county built a proper one, surrounded by the shelves of books that had stayed here when the collection moved, and she held the piece of paper in both hands and read those 3 sentences several times. She had known, in an abstract way, that the chairs had been deliberate. He told her the story of making them, that first night, in pieces over the years. She'd known the second chair was built for someone. She'd known she was that someone. What she hadn't known, what those 3 sentences showed her, written in private, written to no one, written because he'd needed to say it to himself in the way that people need to write certain things down in order to fully believe they happened, was the simple, complete satisfaction of a man who had made a bet on something he couldn't prove and found out he was right. Not triumphant, not self-congratulatory, just right in the way that matters most. Quietly, privately right, in the part of himself that he kept to himself and showed to no one. She sat at the desk for a long time. The thing she understood, holding that paper, was something she'd been close to understanding for years but hadn't quite assembled into words until now. Gideon had built the chairs before he had any reason to believe they'd both be filled. That was the part that had always sounded, when she'd described it to other people, like a romantic gesture. The lonely homesteader and his empty chair, the faith of it, the sweetness. But it was not a romantic gesture. Or it was not only that. It was something more specific and more useful and, to her mind, more genuinely admirable. It was a decision, a choice made in the absence of evidence, based on nothing more than a clear-eyed assessment of what he wanted and the decision to act as though it was possible rather than wait for proof that it was. He had not waited to feel certain. He had not waited for someone to come along first and then built the chair to accommodate her. He had built the chair, and then he had gone looking for the person to fill it, and those 2 things in that order were not incidental. The chair was the commitment. The advertisement was the action that followed from it. She had spent 30 years watching him make decisions that way, at the ranch, with the cattle, with the hard seasons. He never waited for a situation to be safe before he engaged with it. He assessed what was true, decided what he wanted, and moved. The movement was never reckless. He was not a reckless man, but it was never paralyzed by the uncertainty that paralyzed other people. He seemed to understand something that most people spent their whole lives missing, which was that the certainty you were looking for didn't come before the decision. It came after. You made the choice, and the choice created the conditions for the certainty to follow. She had read his advertisement in Philadelphia, and she had written back to it, which had taken more courage than she usually credited herself with. She had gotten on the train, which had taken more still. She had sat in the second chair on the first evening before she knew anything about whether this was going to work. And that had also been a decision made in the absence of proof. 2 people, on opposite sides of a very large country, making the same kind of decision. Not because they were certain, but because the alternative was to spend your life not making the decision. And that had seemed to both of them like a worse option. She folded the draft carefully and put it back in the folder. Then she went to the porch and sat in her chair in the April afternoon. The prairie was doing the spring thing, the grass coming back, the particular green gold of new growth, the meadowlarks making their argument in the middle distance. The east horizon was the same horizon it had always been, flat and enormous, and unconcerned with the human scale of things. The chair beside her was empty. She looked at it, the worn wood, the chair that had existed before she had any knowledge of it, that had waited for her through 2 Kansas winters before she arrived, that had held her in every season of her adult life, that had held him beside her for 25 years. She thought about the 3 sentences on the back of the draft. She took a breath of the April air, which was cold still at the edges, spring on the prairie always arriving later than you felt it should. She put her hands in her lap. She looked east. What they had built was not a monument to anything. It was not a love story in the way that stories told love. No grand declarations, no extraordinary moments strung together into a highlight reel. It was ordinary time made extraordinary by the quality of attention they had brought to it. It was 30 years of mornings and difficult seasons and arguments about kitchen storage and a library that 400 children had walked through. It was a boy who became a lawyer because a woman had taken his questions seriously. It was a girl who named a bird. It was 5 head of cattle lost in a drought that was survived because 2 people had planned for what the other would not have planned for. It was 2 people who were each, individually, not easy to live with, and who had built a life together that neither of them could have built alone. Not because they completed each other in some neat and symmetrical way, but because their particular incompatibilities had produced, over time, something better than either of their individual competencies would have achieved. The chairs were the same chairs. The wood had been repaired and maintained and was not the original wood in every part, but the chairs were the same. They were not beautiful. They had never been beautiful. They were solid and level, and they were built to last, and they had. Margaret sat in her chair on the April porch and let the Kansas afternoon do what it always did. Stretch out in every direction without apology, the sky taking up more space than felt reasonable, the grass moving in its continuous, patient way. A meadowlark landed on the fence post at the edge of the yard, stayed for a moment, left. She was 53 years old. She had 2 children and 4 grandchildren she hadn't mentioned yet because Eleanor had told her last month, cautiously. The way Eleanor delivered news, she wasn't sure how it would land. And it had landed fine. It had landed more than fine. It had landed the way things land when you are a person who has been around long enough to know that this is the part that matters. The ongoing part. The part that keeps going after you. The library had 412 books. Thomas More's oldest daughter had just started coming to the Saturday readings. The east fence was holding. She sat in her chair and she did not look at the empty one beside her with grief exactly, though grief was part of it, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. She looked at it with something more complicated than grief, with the specific recognition that an empty chair is not only an absence. It is also a record of everything that filled it. It is evidence of a life that was there, that sat in it, that chose it, that came back to it season after season for 25 years. He had been right about the chairs. She had sat in it. She was still sitting in it. And the thing he had been right about was not just that someone would come and fill the second chair, it was that building the chair was the act of faith that made everything else possible. Not the advertisement, not the letters. The chair, built in the middle of the night with no audience and no guarantee, built for someone he had not yet found, sat on a porch facing east in the dark. That was the real thing. That was the thing she had spent 30 years learning to fully understand. The wind moved through the prairie grass, and the meadowlark came back to the fence post, and this time stayed. And the April light went long and gold across the flat land in every direction, and Margaret Hale sat on her porch in her chair and watched the Kansas sky do its unreasonable thing, and she stayed there until the cold drove her in, which was later than it should have been. She'd left the empty chair where it was. She always left it where it was.
Creep? What the fuck? What do you mean creep? Oh no! 现在我有冰淇淋。
killed Ben is hauling ass.
Yeah, it's the fucking baby, I think. There's one more thing over there, Zerty. Oh wait, Zerty's already on the way. Guess it's just us now, Chandler Chan. Ooh, 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 kill him. Ooh, kill him. Ooh, kill him. Don't hurt him now. Don't hurt him. Ooh, don't hurt him.
You want to try to grab this little thing?
Oh wait, also something that's kind of helpful. Wait, stop. We can bring Ben's corpse back.
Oh.
And alright.
Do you want to try to grab the bee nest?
Yeah. You know what? Yeah. Okay, we can do that. Okay, Zerty, make sure you drop all your shit. Okay, Zerty, we're gonna go try and get the bee nest. Here's the plan. I'm gonna sacrifice my life for Pakistan. Okay, so I'm gonna try and distract the bees. Chandler, you grab it. Zerty, you stay here and you pull the thing once Chandler has it on the balcony. Okay. Make sure you teleport my body back as well. So just focus it on me already. All right, here we go. You ready?
Yeah.
All right. Oh, whoa. Too close. No. No, why are you taking it further away? Oh, wait a minute. Okay, drop it and run. Go. Zerty, come on. Zerty, go. Zerty, just go. Zerty! Why did they come after me?
I don't know.
Yeah, that shit was chalked.
At least we got it.
Yeah, I guess.
Is it on the balcony?
Wait, dude. Yeah, I guess. I think so.
That's good.
Damn, we did really good.
Bro, why'd it go after me?
I don't know. It is on the balcony, right? Or does it teleport inside or anything?
I think it's on the balcony.
I think it was on the front balcony, but I guess we'll have to see.
No, it's behind us. It's this way. Behind this wall.
Here we go, gang. Good luck, base bitch.
Get back to work, base bitch.
What the fuck?
I'm never TPing Ben.
Let's see if we got the
Ben, do you own the walkie?
Oh, I don't see it.
Do you own the walkie, Ben?
There's enemies to your right.
Why me?
Because you're the best one here.
Wait, guys, there's a robot right there.
It's not activated. It activates later.